Before we go any further, it is worth noting men are more likely to perpetrate and be victims of violent crime. Over 80% of violent crimes are perpetrated by men according to the 2020 Crime Survey for England and Wales. This is important owing to the common argument against men talking about being victims of violent crime because the perpetrators are men. We will discuss why talking about violent crime against men is important, especially for women in a little bit, but before then, if men should not talk about being victims of violent crime because the perpetrators are men, then neither should women talk about slut-shaming because it is perpetrated, in part, mostly, or entirely, by high-status women who seek to assert a class advantage over their peers. High-status women employ slut discourse to assert class advantage, defining themselves as classy rather than trashy, while low-status women express class resentment, deriding rich, bitchy sluts for their exclusivity. Slut discourse enables, rather than constrains, sexual experimentation for the high-status women whose definitions prevail in the dominant social scene. This is a form of sexual privilege. That being said, here we go. According to the 2020 Crime Survey for England and Wales, men are more likely than women to be victims of violent crime, that is, 2% compared to 1.3% of women. The susceptibility to violent crime holds true for all types of crimes except domestic abuse, where it is 0.3% of women and 0.1% of men. Estimates of domestic abuse showing that 8.1% of women and 4% of men are victims are from the self-completion module of the survey. Victimization by a stranger shows the greatest differentiation by gender, that is 1.2% for men and 0.4% for women. 36% of stranger violence involves more than one perpetrator, compared to 27% of acquaintance violence. 0.5% of men and 0.7% of women report experiencing violence perpetrated by an acquaintance. The incidence of stranger violence fell by 52% from 1995, while the incidence of acquaintance violence fell by 75% in 1995. 60% of violence victims are male, implying that 40% are female, with the numbers being reversed in instances where violence victims did not report any injuries, that is, 60% of violence victims without injuries are female. 73% of homicide victims are male. Male susceptibility to violent crime holds true even for children, with 3.6% of boys aged 10 to 15 years reporting being victims, compared to 1.4% of girls. According to the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics, CBS, 2.5% of men and 1.7% of women report being victims of violent crime. Intimidation is the most common form of violence reported by 1.6% of men and 1.1% of women. 0.9% of men and 0.5% of women are victims of assault, with more women reporting sexual violence, which is the only form of violent crime where women outnumber men, if this graph is anything to go by. Half of all violent crime against women is committed by people known to them, while only 38% of male victims of violent crime know the perpetrators. According to this graph, half of all violent crimes against men are committed on the streets, with this number being 43% for female victims. 21% of female victims report being assaulted in their homes, with this number being 11% for men. Men are twice as likely as women to be victims of violent crime in hospitality establishments. According to this 1994 report by the American Department of Justice, which is the most common in all the searches, we don't understand why they haven't released subsequent ones like they do with the overall criminal victimizations, such as these ones that we will get back to briefly. 6.6 million men and 5 million women were victims of violent crime in 1994, that is, for every 2 female victims of violent crime, there were 3 male victims. Females were more likely to be victimized by someone they knew at 62%, while males were more likely to be victimized by a stranger at 63%. 31% of female homicide victims are known to their perpetrators, with this number being 4% for male victims. 4 in 5 victims of intimate violence are women. Separated women are 1.5 times more likely to be victims of violent victimizations compared to divorced men and women. When a violent act is perpetrated by multiple people, men and women were more likely to be victimized by strangers at 79% and 65% respectively. This table could paint a clearer picture of victimization by a stranger as opposed to by an acquaintance, which shows that men are more likely to be victimized by a stranger. Offenders are armed for 34% of violent crimes against male victims, compared to 24% of female victims. In assaults, but not robberies, females were more likely to sustain an injury, with male victims being more likely to be seriously hurt in instances where crimes led to injuries. Females are more likely to be victimized in their home than anywhere else, while males are more likely to be victimized in public spaces, such as open areas, parking lots, and business centers. Should have started with this table, but well, we are here now. Check out the differences in homicide rates. How about non-fatal victimizations? And the robberies? Aggravated assault and simple assaults? Men are overrepresented in all forms of violent crimes, except for rape or sexual assault. For those who understand numbers better with graphs, here we go, my friends. And these are trends from 1973 to 1994. Check out these latest trends on criminal victimization by overall numbers, paying careful attention to what is mostly reported than the other. The rates of rape or sexual assaults are almost close to those of robberies, for all those years from 2015, but they are nowhere close to assault, again for the same duration. All these statistics bearing in mind that according to the report, females are more likely than males to report robberies and simple assault to law enforcement. So if men and women would report these violent crimes at similar rates, we would have completely different numbers. Just to take you back a bit, I'm sure the statistics surrounding female homicide victims being more likely to be killed by an intimate partner are not exactly new to you, especially considering the whole social construction of domestic violence, but I might have come across some information that could be new to you. Different studies present varied statistics on rates at which husbands kill wives, and vice versa. For instance, one study concluded that 41% of female homicide victims were killed by their husbands, compared to 11% of male victims. Another study found that 62% of female homicide victims were murdered by their husbands, compared to 14% of male victims who were murdered by their wives. These figures, plus those picked from the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics, misrepresent the whole homicide picture since they are based on all homicide cases, and men are more likely to be killed by a stranger and an acquaintance than women are, so the perpetrators of male homicide are quite diverse. If the percentages are taken for only individuals who are involved romantically or married, the ratio is about 50-50 or splits in half, with wives being as likely as husbands to kill their spouse. It is worth noting that the escalation of altercation into murder depends on the involvement of weapons, especially guns and knives, and female partners, because of their physical disadvantage, are more likely to use weapons, including in self-defense. The female physical disadvantage, combined with the fact that male homicide is more likely to involve the weapon, presents quite the situation. The mode of executing a homicide, as we have seen, is of special interest. Husbands, because of the physical advantage, are more likely to be violent, which includes severe beating, cutting, stabbing, and shooting, all of which are easy to trace back to the perpetrator. Apart from using weapons, wives' physical disadvantage leads to the choice of alternatives, including poisoning and hiring hitmen. When a husband is poisoned, and they die, say of something like a heart attack or stroke, the death is attributed to natural causes even if the victim did not have a history of illness, since postmortems or autopsies are rarely conducted on the body in such instances. Cases of food poisonings are rarely traced back to the wife, since people generally get their food from different places. Even when a hitman and the quote-unquote employer are arrested, the homicide is not categorized as wife killing husband, but as death by a third party or by a stranger.